In the quiet hours when the world grows still and dreams begin to stir, there exists a story that spans more than 1,000 years, carried on the winds that cross the narrow waters where Europe meets Asia. It is the story of a city that rose from the ashes of one empire to become the heart of another. A place where the golden dome of Hagia Sophia caught the first light of dawn and reflected it across waters that have witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations. The Bosphorus flows gently between two continents, its currents carrying the whispers of ancient prayers and the echoes of imperial proclamations. Here, where the Sea of Marmara opens into the Golden Horn, where merchant ships once anchored beneath walls that seemed to touch the heavens themselves, stood Constantinople, the city of Constantine, the queen of cities, the jewel of the Byzantine Empire that blazed like a beacon across the medieval world. Long before emperors dreamed of their new Rome, before Christian crosses crowned the Seven Hills, this place knew other names and other glories. The Greeks called it Byzantium, and it was here that legend speaks of a blind king who chose the site by divine guidance, though his eyes could not see the strategic perfection of this narrow passage between worlds. The waters that surrounded it on three sides formed a natural harbour so perfect that sailors spoke of it as if it were carved by the gods themselves. In those ancient days, when the Persian Empire stretched its arms across the known world and Greek city-states flickered like candles in the darkness, Byzantium stood as a modest settlement. Its people lived quietly by the sea, fishing the abundant waters, trading with the ships that passed through the strait. They could not have imagined that their humble city would one day become the center of the world, that emperors would walk where they cast their nets, that the greatest church in Christendom would rise where their simple temples honored ancient gods. The transformation began with ambition, as all great changes do. In the early decades of the 4th century after Christ, when the Roman Empire still commanded the known world, but showed the first signs of the exhaustion that comes with vastness, a man named Constantine gazed upon the ancient site and saw not what was, but what could be. Constantine had already reshaped the world in ways both subtle and profound. He was the first Roman emperor to embrace the Christian faith, transforming a persecuted religion into the favored creed of the imperial court. Yet his vision extended beyond matters of spirit to questions of power, politics, and the eternal challenge of governing an empire that stretched from the Atlantic to the Euphrates. Rome itself, eternal though it claimed to be, had grown unwieldy. The city that had once been the beating heart of the empire now felt distant from the eastern provinces where new threats emerged and new opportunities beckoned. Persian armies pressed against the frontier while barbarian tribes probed the northern boundaries. The wealth of Egypt and Syria, the grain that fed the empire, the taxes that filled its treasuries, all flowed from lands that lay far from the Tiber. Constantine understood that power, to remain effective, must be where the greatest challenges and greatest resources converged. Standing on the hills above the Bosphorus in the year 324, Constantine surveyed the site with the practiced eye of a military commander and the expansive vision of an emperor. The position commanded the strait that connected the Black Sea to the Mediterranean, controlling the flow of grain from the Ukraine, the silk from China, the spices from India. 3 sides protected by water, the 4th defended by walls that could be built to withstand any siege. Climate mild enough for year-round campaigning. Harbours deep enough for the largest fleets. Hills suitable for palaces that would rival anything in Rome itself. Yet Constantine's decision to build his new city here was not merely strategic. the emperor had experienced visions, divine communications that guided his most important choices. Christian historians would later write that Christ himself had appeared to Constantine in dreams, showing him the site where the new Christian capital should rise. Whether divine inspiration or imperial pragmatism guided his choice, the result was the same. On November 8th, 324, Constantine took a spear in his hand and began to trace the boundaries of his new city, walking the perimeter that would define the walls of what would become the most important city in the Christian world. The construction of the new capital began immediately, but this was not to be merely another Roman city. Constantine envisioned something grander, something that would surpass even Rome in its magnificence. Architects and engineers were summoned from across the empire. Artisans skilled in marble and mosaic, craftsmen who could work gold and silver, builders who understood the secrets of constructing domes that seemed to float without support, all were invited to contribute to the great work. The emperor spared no expense, drawing on the treasuries of the entire empire to fund his grand design. The city that rose from these foundations bore Constantine's name, but it was conceived as a new Rome, complete with 7 hills, a senate house, and all the institutions that had made the original great. Yet from the beginning, Constantinople was distinctly different from its predecessor. Where Rome had grown organically over centuries, accumulation upon accumulation of buildings and districts, Constantinople was planned as a unified whole. Its streets were laid out in rational patterns, its districts organized according to function and status. Most significantly, it was designed from the beginning as a Christian city. The traditional gods of Rome were not honored here with temples and shrines. Instead, churches rose on the hills of Constantinople, their crosses catching the light that reflected off the waters of the Golden Horn. The greatest of these was the first Hagia Sophia, the Church of Holy Wisdom, begun during Constantine's reign, though not completed until after his death. This first cathedral was smaller than the magnificent structure that would later bear the same name, but it established the pattern that would mark Constantinople throughout its history. A city where Christian faith and imperial power merged into a single, overwhelming presence. Constantine died before his city was truly complete, but his successors understood the wisdom of his vision. The new capital grew rapidly, drawing population from across the empire. Nobles seeking favor at the imperial court built palaces on the Bosphorus. Merchants arrived to take advantage of the city's position on the great trade routes. Craftsmen came to serve the growing population. Within a few generations, Constantinople rivaled Rome not only in political importance, but in population and wealth. The transformation was not merely physical, but cultural and spiritual. Constantine had legalized Christianity, but it was in his new city that the faith truly came to define an empire. The bishops of Constantinople, eventually to be known as patriarchs, commanded authority second only to the Pope in Rome. Theological debates that would define Christian doctrine for centuries were conducted in the city's churches and monasteries. The emperor himself was understood not merely as a political ruler, but as God's chosen representative on earth, appointed to guide the Christian empire until the end of time. This fusion of Christianity and imperial authority created something unprecedented in the ancient world, a state that understood itself in explicitly religious terms. The emperors of Constantinople were not merely commanders and administrators. They were protectors of the true faith, responsible for maintaining orthodoxy against heretical teachings and defending Christian lands against pagan enemies. This understanding would shape Byzantine policy for the next 1,000 years. influencing decisions on everything from taxation to military strategy to diplomatic relations with neighboring powers. The early centuries of Constantinople's existence were marked by both triumph and crisis. The city became the center of a complex administrative system that governed territories stretching from southern Italy to the Caucasus, from the Danube to the borders of Egypt. Yet the empire faced constant challenges. Persian armies invaded from the east, seeking to reclaim lands they had lost to Roman expansion. Slavic tribes pressed down from the north, crossing the Danube and settling in territories that had been Roman for centuries. In the west, the empire gradually lost control of territories in Italy and Africa to Germanic kingdoms, and later to the expanding power of Islam. Perhaps the greatest crisis came in the 7th century, when the rise of Islam created a new and formidable adversary. The armies of the Caliphate, inspired by their new faith and led by brilliant commanders, swept out of the Arabian Peninsula and conquered vast territories that had been Byzantine for centuries. Syria and Palestine, the birthplace of Christianity, fell to the Muslim armies. Egypt, with its invaluable grain harvests and tax revenues, was lost. The great Christian cities of Antioch and Jerusalem came under Muslim rule. These losses were not merely territorial, but spiritual. To the Byzantines, the success of the Muslim armies seemed to call into question God's favor toward the Christian empire. How could the true faith suffer such defeats at the hands of what they considered a false religion? The crisis prompted intense theological reflection and political reform. Some emperors concluded that God was punishing the empire for tolerating the worship of icons, images of Christ and the saints that had become central to Byzantine Christianity. The resulting iconoclastic controversy would tear the empire apart for over a century, pitting emperor against patriarch, monastery against court, theologian against theologian. The iconoclastic emperors, beginning with Leo III in the early 8th century, ordered the destruction of religious images throughout the empire. Icons were smashed, mosaics were plastered over, and anyone who defended the traditional practice of venerating images faced persecution. The policy was intended to restore God's favor and military success, but its effects were largely the opposite. The iconoclastic controversy weakened the empire internally, while failing to restore its external fortunes. Worse, it created a permanent rift between Constantinople and Rome, where the Pope condemned iconoclasm as heretical. This religious dispute would eventually contribute to the Great Schism that permanently divided Eastern and Western Christianity. During these turbulent centuries, Constantinople itself evolved from Constantine's planned city into something more complex and organic. The population grew to perhaps 500,000 inhabitants, making it one of the largest cities in the world. The original walls proved insufficient to contain this growth, and new fortifications were built further west, creating the famous land wall that would protect the city for 8 centuries. This wall, with its double line of fortifications, its towers and gates, its carefully designed fields of fire, was considered the greatest military engineering achievement of its age. Within these walls, Constantinople developed distinct neighborhoods, each with its own character and population. The area around the imperial palace was home to the aristocracy, their mansions built in classical style, with marble columns and mosaics depicting both Christian and classical themes. The harbor districts housed merchants and craftsmen, their workshops producing the luxury goods that made Constantinople famous throughout the known world. Silk that rivaled anything from China, gold jewelry of extraordinary intricacy, illuminated manuscripts whose beauty was unmatched anywhere in Europe. The religious quarter centered on Hagia Sophia drew pilgrims from across the Christian world. Monks and theologians lived in monasteries scattered throughout the city, their libraries preserving not only Christian texts, but also the classical learning of Greece and Rome. It was largely through Byzantine scholars that knowledge of Aristotle, Plato, and other ancient philosophers would eventually reach Western Europe during the Renaissance. The University of Constantinople, heir to the ancient schools of Athens and Alexandria, maintained the highest standards of learning in mathematics, philosophy, theology, and medicine. The daily life of Constantinople reflected its unique position between East and West, between the classical past and the Christian present. The Hippodrome, modelled on the Circus Maximus in Rome, drew crowds of 100,000 to watch chariot races that were as much political demonstrations as sporting events. The blues and greens, the great racing factions, represented not merely teams but political parties, and their rivalry sometimes erupted into violence that threatened the stability of the government. The most famous such riot, the Nika riots of 532, nearly drove the Emperor Justinian from his throne and resulted in the destruction of much of the city centre. Justinian's response to the Nika riots exemplified the grandeur and ambition that characterized Constantinople at its height. Rather than simply rebuilding what had been destroyed, he used the crisis as an opportunity to create something unprecedented. The new Hagia Sophia that rose from the ashes of the riot was not merely a church, but a statement about the nature of imperial power and Christian faith. Designed by Anthemius of Tralles and Isidore of Miletus, two of the greatest architects of the age, the building combined classical engineering with innovative techniques to create a dome that seemed to float weightlessly above the vast interior space. The construction of Hagia Sophia required resources drawn from across the empire. Marble came from quarries in Greece and Asia Minor. Columns were taken from classical temples, including 8 enormous porphyry columns said to have come from the Temple of the Sun at Baalbek. Gold was lavished on the interior decoration, while the dome was covered with a mosaic of Christ Pantocrator that could be seen for miles across the city. When the building was completed in 537, Justinian is said to have exclaimed, "Solomon, I have outdone thee," comparing his achievement to the Temple of Jerusalem. Hagia Sophia was more than an architectural triumph. It was the physical embodiment of Byzantine imperial ideology. The building combined the earthly power of the emperor with the heavenly authority of Christ. The imperial throne was positioned directly beneath the Great Dome, so that the emperor appeared to sit literally under the protection of divine authority. The complex liturgy performed in the church, with its elaborate processions and magnificent chanting, served to reinforce the connection between heavenly and earthly hierarchies. Foreign ambassadors, who witnessed services in Hagia Sophia, were meant to understand that they were in the presence not merely of a powerful ruler, but of God's chosen representative on earth. The reign of Justinian, which lasted from 527 to 565, represented both the high point of Byzantine power and the beginning of its long decline. The emperor's ambition was nothing less than the restoration of the Roman Empire to its ancient boundaries. His generals, led by the brilliant Belisarius, reconquered much of Italy from the Germanic kingdoms that had established themselves there after the fall of Rome. Byzantine armies retook North Africa from the Vandals and established footholds in Spain. For a brief moment, it seemed as though the Mediterranean might once again become a Roman lake. Yet these conquests came at enormous cost. The campaigns required vast expenditures of money and manpower that exhausted the empire's resources. The plague of Justinian, which struck the empire repeatedly during the 6th century, killed millions and undermined the economic foundations of Byzantine power. Worse, the reconquests proved impossible to maintain. Within decades of Justinian's death, most of the recovered territories were lost again, this time permanently. The empire that survived into the 7th century was smaller, poorer, and more vulnerable than the one Justinian had inherited. The crisis of the 7th century, with the rise of Islam and the loss of the eastern provinces, forced a fundamental transformation of the Byzantine Empire. The classical administrative system inherited from Rome proved inadequate to the new challenges. Beginning in the 7th century, the emperors implemented a new system called the theme system, which combined military and civilian authority in the hands of regional commanders called strategoi. This system proved more flexible and effective than the old Roman model, but it also marked the end of the classical Roman Empire and the beginning of something new, the medieval Byzantine Empire centered on Constantinople and Anatolia. The new empire that emerged from this transformation was more compact, but also more resilient. The theme system created a citizen soldier class that had a direct stake in defending their territories. The loss of the eastern provinces, while devastating, also freed the empire from the enormous expense of defending long frontiers in hostile terrain. Most importantly, the survival of Constantinople itself, behind its magnificent walls and protected by the greatest navy in the Mediterranean, provided a base from which the empire could rebuild. The rebuilding took centuries, but by the 9th and 10th centuries, the Byzantine Empire had entered a new golden age. The iconoclastic controversy was finally resolved in favor of the icon venerators, restoring unity between church and state. Military reforms created professional armies that could compete effectively with the caliphate and the emerging powers of Western Europe. Most importantly, a series of brilliant emperors combined effective administration with successful military campaigns to restore Byzantine power and prestige. The emperor, Basil II, who ruled from 976 to 1025, exemplified this Byzantine renaissance. Known as Basil the Bulgar Slayer for his successful campaigns against the Bulgarian kingdom, he restored Byzantine control over the Balkans and established the empire's authority as far north as the Danube. Under his rule, the empire's boundaries reached from southern Italy to the Caucasus, from the Crimea to Crete. Byzantine missionaries converted the Bulgarians, Serbs, and Russians to Orthodox Christianity, creating a commonwealth of Orthodox nations that looked to Constantinople for both spiritual and political leadership. The economic prosperity that accompanied this political revival was reflected in the grandeur of Constantinople itself. The city's population may have reached 750,000, making it by far the largest city in Europe. Its harbours were filled with ships from across the known world. Venetian merchants bringing goods from Western Europe, Arab traders carrying spices and silk from Asia, Russian merchants floating down the Dnieper with furs and amber from the forests of the north. The streets were paved with marble, the buildings decorated with mosaics and frescoes of extraordinary beauty. The imperial palace, known as the Great Palace, was actually a complex of buildings, courtyards, and gardens that covered much of the southeastern corner of the city. Foreign ambassadors described halls lined with precious metals, mechanical lions that roared, and birds that sang, throne rooms where the emperor appeared elevated above his subjects, as if suspended between earth and heaven. The ceremonies of the Byzantine court, described in minute detail in the Book of Ceremonies compiled during the 10th century, were designed to overwhelm visitors with the majesty and mystery of imperial power. Yet perhaps the most remarkable feature of Constantinople during this golden age was its cultural and intellectual life. The city was home to the greatest library in the world, containing not only Christian texts, but also classical works of philosophy, history, science, and literature. Byzantine scholars preserved and commented on the complete works of Plato, most of Aristotle, the histories of Herodotus and Thucydides, the poetry of Homer and Pindar. Without their efforts, much of classical learning would have been lost to posterity. The University of Constantinople attracted students from across Europe and beyond. Its faculty included some of the greatest minds of the age. Leo the mathematician, whose work in algebra was centuries ahead of its time. Photius, the patriarch whose library contained summaries of classical works that survive nowhere else. Constantine VII, Porphyrogenitos, emperor and scholar whose writings on imperial administration and foreign policy remain invaluable sources for medieval history. This intellectual flowering extended beyond purely scholarly pursuits to practical applications that benefited the empire's military and economic power. Byzantine engineers perfected the use of Greek fire, an incendiary weapon that made their navy nearly invincible for centuries. Byzantine craftsmen developed new techniques in silk production that broke the Chinese monopoly on this luxury trade. Byzantine diplomats created a sophisticated intelligence network that kept the imperial government informed of developments across Europe, Asia, and Africa. The prosperity and power of the 10th century empire attracted admiration and envy from less fortunate neighbours. The Emperor Constantine VII wrote detailed instructions for his successors on how to manage relations with foreign powers, using a combination of diplomacy, bribery, marriage alliances, and military pressure to maintain Byzantine advantages. This system worked well as long as the empire remained strong and unified, but it contained the seeds of future problems. The success of the theme system had created a powerful military aristocracy that gradually accumulated vast estates in Anatolia. These military families, the Phocuses, the Skleroses, the Malinois, commanded the loyalty of their soldiers and controlled the resources of entire provinces. As long as they remained loyal to the emperor in Constantinople, their power strengthened the empire. But when they turned against the central government, their resources could be used to challenge imperial authority itself. The crisis began in the 11th century with a series of weak emperors who lacked the political skill to manage the competing factions within the empire. The military aristocracy of Anatolia fought for control with the civilian bureaucracy of Constantinople. The church became involved in political disputes, with different monastic factions supporting different imperial claimants. Foreign enemies took advantage of this internal disorder to press their own claims against Byzantine territory. The most serious threat came from a new and unexpected direction. The Seljuk Turks, a nomadic people from Central Asia who had recently converted to Islam, began pressing into Anatolia in the middle of the 11th century. Unlike the Arabs of the early Islamic conquests, who were primarily interested in raiding and tribute, the Turks came as permanent settlers, bringing their flocks and families and establishing themselves on lands that had been Byzantine for centuries. The Byzantine response to this threat was hampered by the internal political crisis. The Emperor Romanos IV Diogenes, who came to power in 1068, attempted to restore the situation through a massive military campaign that would drive the Turks back beyond the Euphrates. The campaign of 1071 assembled the largest Byzantine army in generations, drawing troops from across the empire and including foreign mercenaries, hired with gold from the imperial treasury. The Battle of Manzikert, fought on August 26, 1071, would prove to be one of the most decisive engagements in medieval history. The exact details of what happened remain disputed, but the outcome was catastrophic for the Byzantine Empire. Romanos IV was captured by the Seljuk Sultan Alp Arslan, and his army was scattered or destroyed. Worse than the immediate military defeat was its political consequence. News of the disaster triggered a civil war in Constantinople that prevented any effective response to the Turkish occupation of Anatolia. The aftermath of Manzikert marked the beginning of the end for the Byzantine Empire as a great power. The loss of Anatolia, the heartland of the theme system, and the source of the empire's best soldiers, could not be compensated by the wealth of Constantinople alone. The Turks established the Sultanate of Rum with its capital at Nicaea, only a few days' march from Constantinople itself. The empire that had once stretched from Italy to Armenia was reduced to the area around Constantinople, parts of Greece, and scattered holdings elsewhere. The emperors who ruled during this crisis showed remarkable resilience in the face of seemingly impossible odds. Alexios I Komnenos, who came to power in 1081, managed to stabilize the situation through a combination of military skill, diplomatic cunning, and sheer determination. Unable to field armies large enough to reconquer Anatolia, he instead played the various Turkish leaders against each other while building alliances with Venice and other Western powers. It was Alexios who made the fateful decision to ask for help from Western Europe, sending ambassadors to the Pope in Rome requesting military assistance against the Muslim occupation of Christian lands. The Pope's response exceeded anything Alexios had imagined or desired. Urban II proclaimed the First Crusade in 1095, calling on all Christian knights to march to the east and reclaim the Holy Land from Muslim rule. The arrival of the crusading armies created both opportunities and problems for the Byzantine Empire. On one hand, the Crusaders did succeed in reconquering parts of Anatolia and establishing Christian states in Syria and Palestine that served as buffers between the empire and its Muslim enemies. On the other hand, the Westerners proved to be unreliable allies whose own ambitions often conflicted with Byzantine interests. The Norman leader Bohemond, for example, carved out a principality for himself at Antioch that was technically Byzantine territory. Constantinople became a way station for successive waves of crusaders traveling to the Holy Land. The city's inhabitants watched with mixed feelings as tens of thousands of armed Westerners passed through their streets. Some expeditions brought welcomed trade and revenue, but others threatened the city's security and stability. The cultural differences between East and West, which had been growing since the iconoclastic controversy, became increasingly apparent as contact increased. The Western chroniclers who accompanied the Crusades left detailed descriptions of Constantinople that reveal both admiration and suspicion. They marveled at the city's size and wealth, its magnificent buildings and sophisticated culture. Yet they also criticized what they saw as Byzantine duplicity and cowardice, misunderstanding the complex diplomatic strategies that the emperors used to survive in a hostile environment. These mutual misunderstandings would have tragic consequences in the long run. The 12th century saw the Byzantine Empire achieve a partial recovery under the Komnenos dynasty. Manuel the Bar Komnenos, who ruled from 1143 to 1180, managed to restore Byzantine influence in the Balkans and southern Italy, while maintaining the alliance with the crusading states. Constantinople during his reign rivaled its ancient glory, with a population that may have reached 400,000 and a cultural life that attracted scholars and artists from across Europe. The court of Manuel I was famous for its luxury and sophistication. The emperor himself was a patron of learning who spoke several languages and corresponded with scholars across Europe. His palace was decorated with classical and Christian art of extraordinary beauty, while his library contained works in Greek, Latin, Arabic, and other languages. Foreign visitors were consistently impressed by the wealth and culture they encountered in Constantinople, even as they sometimes criticized Byzantine political and military practices. Yet the recovery of the 12th century was built on fragile foundations. The empire's financial resources were strained by the constant military campaigns required to maintain its reduced territories. The theme system, which had provided reliable soldiers for centuries, was breaking down as military aristocrats converted their holdings into private estates worked by peasant tenants. The navy, once the guarantee of Constantinople's security, was increasingly dependent on Venetian and other foreign merchants who demanded commercial privileges in return for their support. The death of Manuel I in 1180 triggered another succession crisis that exposed these underlying weaknesses. His son Alexios II was only 11 years old, and the regency was contested by different factions within the court. The crisis was resolved by Andronikos I Komnenos, the emperor's nephew, who seized power through a combination of popular support and military force. However, his reign proved to be a disaster that accelerated the empire's decline. Andronikos I attempted to solve the empire's problems through radical reforms that attacked the privileges of the aristocracy and the church. He reduced taxes on the peasantry while confiscating estates from wealthy families. He restricted the commercial privileges of Venetian and other foreign merchants, attempting to restore Byzantine control over the empire's own trade. He purged the administration of officials he considered corrupt or disloyal, replacing them with men chosen for their ability rather than their birth. These reforms might have strengthened the empire in the long run, but they created powerful enemies who were determined to destroy the emperor who threatened their interests. The aristocracy conspired against him, while the church condemned his policies as impious. The Venetians, whose commercial interests were threatened, encouraged rebellion against his rule. Foreign enemies took advantage of the internal disorder to press their own claims against Byzantine territory. The end came in 1185 when Isaac II Angelos overthrew Andronikos in a palace coup that enjoyed wide support among the Constantinople aristocracy. The new emperor reversed most of his predecessors' reforms, restoring aristocratic privileges and foreign commercial concessions. However, the damage had been done. The brief period of radical government had further weakened imperial institutions, while failing to solve the fundamental problems that threatened the empire's survival. The Angelos dynasty, which ruled from 1185 to 1204, presided over the final collapse of the medieval Byzantine Empire. The emperors Isaac II and Alexios III were weak rulers who lacked both the political skill and the military ability to deal with the empire's mounting problems. The Bulgarians and Serbs established independent kingdoms in the Balkans, while the Turks continued their advance in Anatolia. Most seriously, the relationship with the Western crusading states deteriorated as cultural and religious differences became increasingly difficult to bridge. The crisis came to a head with the Fourth Crusade, which began in 1202 with the stated goal of conquering Egypt and liberating Jerusalem. However, the crusading army became entangled in Byzantine politics when the deposed emperor Isaac II sought their help in regaining his throne. The Venetians, who provided ships for the crusade, had their own reasons for supporting intervention in Byzantine affairs. The result was a disaster that would echo through history. The crusading army arrived at Constantinople in 1203 and succeeded in restoring Isaac II to the throne. However, the restored emperor proved unable to fulfill the promises of money and military support that had been made on his behalf. Relations between the Crusaders and the Byzantines deteriorated rapidly, with each side accusing the other of treachery and bad faith. The situation exploded in April 1204 when the Crusaders, encouraged by the Venetians, decided to conquer Constantinople itself. The siege of Constantinople lasted only a few days. The Great Land Wall that had protected the city for 8 centuries was breached by Western siege engines, and the crusading army poured into the streets. What followed was one of the most devastating sacks in medieval history. The Crusaders looted churches and palaces, carrying off centuries of accumulated wealth. Priceless manuscripts were destroyed. Irreplaceable works of art were melted down for their precious metals, and the library that had preserved classical learning for 1,000 years was scattered to the winds. The Byzantine Empire, which had survived Persians and Arabs, Bulgars and Russians, finally fell not to foreign pagans or infidels, but to fellow Christians who had come supposedly to defend the faith. The irony was not lost on contemporary observers, who saw in the fall of Constantinople a judgment on the divisions within Christendom itself. The city that had been the greatest centre of Christian civilization in the East was divided among Western nobles who had little understanding of or sympathy for the culture they had destroyed. The Latin Empire of Constantinople, established by the Crusaders after the conquest, was a pale shadow of its Byzantine predecessor. The new rulers controlled only Constantinople itself and the immediate surrounding territory, while Byzantine nobles established independent states in Nicaea, Trebizond, and Epirus. The Bulgarians and Serbs expanded their territories at the expense of the Latin occupiers, while the Turks took advantage of the chaos to advance further into Anatolia. The Latin emperors faced insurmountable problems from the beginning. They lacked the administrative expertise to govern effectively, the military resources to defend their territories, and the financial means to maintain their armies. Most importantly, they never gained the loyalty of their Greek-speaking subjects, who saw them as foreign occupiers rather than legitimate rulers. The Orthodox clergy refused to accept the authority of Latin bishops, while the common people remained hostile to their Western overlords. Meanwhile, in Nicaea, the Byzantine government in exile under the Lascaris dynasty worked systematically to restore the empire. The emperor John III Vatatzes, who ruled from 1221 to 1254, proved to be one of the most effective rulers in Byzantine history. Despite controlling only a small territory in western Anatolia, he built a powerful army, established a stable administration, and gradually expanded his control over Greek-speaking territories in both Asia and Europe. The key to the Nicaean success was the careful balance between military pressure and diplomatic negotiation. While maintaining an army capable of defeating Latin and Turkish forces, the Nicaean emperors also worked to isolate their enemies through alliances with Bulgaria, Serbia, and even some Western powers. They presented themselves as the legitimate heirs of the Byzantine Empire, the true protectors of Orthodox Christianity, and the natural leaders of all Greek-speaking peoples. The restoration came in 1261, when Michael VIII Palaiologos, who had seized power in Nicaea 2 years earlier, succeeded in recapturing Constantinople through a combination of military assault and internal conspiracy. The Latin garrison was taken by surprise, and the city fell with relatively little fighting. The sight of the imperial standards flying once again from the walls of Constantinople was greeted with celebration throughout the Orthodox world. However, the restored Byzantine Empire was a much reduced shadow of its former self. The emperors of the Paleologos dynasty, who ruled from 1261 to 1453, controlled only Constantinople, parts of Greece, and scattered territories elsewhere. The empire lacked the resources to rebuild its former power, while new enemies pressed from all sides. The Ottomans, successors to the Seljuk Turks, established themselves in northwestern Anatolia and gradually expanded their control over former Byzantine territories. The restored empire faced a fundamental dilemma that would define its final centuries. To survive against the growing Ottoman threat, it needed Western military assistance, but such assistance came at the price of religious union with Rome. The Orthodox clergy and people remained bitterly opposed to any compromise with Western Christianity, seeing it as a betrayal of their faith and identity. The emperors were thus caught between the necessity of foreign aid and the impossibility of satisfying their subjects' religious convictions. This dilemma played out repeatedly during the 14th and 15th centuries. Emperor Michael VIII himself faced excommunication from his own patriarch for agreeing to the union of churches at the Council of Lyons in 1274. His successors alternately pursued and abandoned negotiations with Rome, depending on the immediate military situation. Each time union was proclaimed, it generated fierce opposition within the empire, while each time it was abandoned, Western assistance disappeared. The internal political situation was further complicated by a series of civil wars that consumed the empire's remaining resources. The most destructive was the conflict between John V Paleologos and John VI Cantacuzene, which lasted from 1341 to 1347 and devastated much of what remained of Byzantine territory. Both sides sought foreign allies, with Cantacuzene ultimately relying on Ottoman troops to secure his victory. This marked the first time that the Ottomans had intervened directly in Byzantine affairs, a precedent that would have fatal consequences. Constantinople during these final centuries remained an impressive city despite the empire's political and military weakness. Foreign visitors continued to marvel at its walls and buildings, its churches and palaces. The population, though much reduced from its medieval peak, still included skilled craftsmen, learned scholars, and wealthy merchants. The court maintained many of the ceremonial traditions that had made Byzantine diplomacy famous throughout the medieval world. Yet beneath the surface, grandeur lay unmistakable signs of decline. Many neighborhoods within the walls were abandoned or given over to agriculture. The great palace complex was largely in ruins, with the emperors residing in much more modest quarters. The navy, once the pride of the empire, consisted of only a handful of vessels. The army was composed largely of foreign mercenaries, whose loyalty was uncertain and whose costs strained the imperial finances. The economic situation was particularly desperate. The empire's remaining territories produced insufficient revenue to support even a modest military establishment. The emperors were forced to debase the currency, pawn the crown jewels, and strip precious metals from church decorations to raise money for essential expenses. Trade, once the foundation of Constantinople's prosperity, was controlled by Venetian and Genoese merchants who paid minimal taxes to the imperial government. Despite these material problems, the final centuries of the Byzantine Empire witnessed a remarkable cultural flowering. Byzantine scholars, aware that their civilization was under mortal threat, made extraordinary efforts to preserve and transmit their intellectual heritage. The Emperor John VIII Palaiologos established a school in Constantinople that attracted students from across Europe. Byzantine manuscripts containing classical texts were copied and sent to the West, where they would play a crucial role in the Renaissance. The scholar Gemistos Plethon, who lived in the early 15th century, exemplified this final Byzantine Renaissance. A philosopher who sought to synthesize Christian theology with Platonic philosophy. He traveled to Italy, where his lectures on Plato inspired Western humanists to establish the Platonic Academy in Florence. His student Bessarion became a cardinal in the Roman Church while maintaining his Byzantine identity, serving as a bridge between Eastern and Western Christianity. This cultural activity took place against the background of the empire's military situation, which grew increasingly desperate with each passing decade. The Ottomans, under Murad I and Bayezid I, established permanent footholds in Europe, conquering much of the Balkans and reducing the Serbian and Bulgarian kingdoms to vassal status. By 1400, the Byzantine Empire consisted essentially of Constantinople itself, the city of Thessalonica, and the despotate of the Morea in southern Greece. The temporary reprieve came from an unexpected source. The Mongol conqueror Timur, sweeping out of Central Asia, defeated the Ottoman Sultan Bayezid I at the Battle of Ankara in 1402 and took him prisoner. The Ottoman state collapsed into civil war as Bayezid's sons fought for succession, giving the Byzantine Empire an unexpected breathing space that would last for half a century. The Emperors Manuel II and John VIII Palaiologos used this respite as effectively as their limited resources allowed. They rebuilt the walls of Constantinople, negotiated carefully with the competing Ottoman factions, and sought to strengthen ties with Western Europe. Manuel II personally travelled to Paris and London, appealing for military assistance against the Muslim threat. His eloquent speeches impressed Western audiences, but they produced little practical aid beyond expressions of sympathy and small monetary contributions. The most serious attempt at securing Western assistance came at the Council of Florence in 1439, where John VIII agreed to the union of the Eastern and Western churches under papal authority. The emperor hoped that this religious compromise would finally unlock the military resources of Western Christendom for the defense of Constantinople. However, the union was rejected by the overwhelming majority of his subjects, led by the clergy and monastic communities who saw it as a betrayal of Orthodox faith. The popular opposition to the union was summed up in the famous declaration of the Grand Duke Lucas Notaras: "Better the Turkish turban than the papal tiara." This sentiment reflected not merely religious conviction, but also a recognition that Ottoman rule, while foreign and Muslim, might be preferable to Western domination that would destroy the distinctive character of Byzantine civilization. Many Byzantines had observed the fate of the Greek communities in territories controlled by Venice and Genoa, where Orthodox Christianity was barely tolerated and Greek culture was systematically suppressed. The final act of the Byzantine drama began in 1451 with the accession of Mehmed II to the Ottoman throne. The young sultan, only 19 years old, was determined to complete the conquest that his predecessors had begun. Unlike earlier Ottoman rulers who had been content to extract tribute from the rump Byzantine state, Mehmed saw the continued existence of Constantinople as an affront to his dignity and a barrier to his broader ambitions. He began preparations for a siege almost immediately after his accession. The preparations were thorough and systematic. Mehmed assembled an army of perhaps 100,000 men, drawn from across the Ottoman Empire and including elite Janissary units, provincial cavalry, irregular infantry, and specialized siege engineers. Most importantly, he commissioned the Hungarian engineer Orban to cast enormous cannons specifically designed to breach the walls of Constantinople. These guns, the largest ever built up to that time, could fire stone balls weighing over 600 pounds with sufficient force to shatter even the strongest fortifications. Constantine the 11th, Palaiologos, the last Byzantine emperor, was well aware of the approaching storm. He had ruled since 1449 and had used every means at his disposal to prepare for the inevitable siege. The walls were repaired and strengthened, supplies were stockpiled within the city, and appeals were sent to every Christian power in Europe for immediate military assistance. Yet Constantine's resources were pitifully small compared to those of his enemy. His army consisted of perhaps 7,000 men, including a small contingent of Genoese volunteers, commanded by Giovanni Giustiniani. The siege began on April 6, 1453, when the Ottoman army deployed around the land wall of Constantinople. For the Byzantines watching from the walls, the sight must have been both awesome and terrifying. The Ottoman camp stretched as far as the eye could see, its countless banners and pavilions creating a city larger than Constantinople itself. The harbour was sealed by a massive chain, while Ottoman ships were dragged overland into the Golden Horn to complete the encirclement. The first phase of the siege focused on the land wall, which had protected Constantinople for over 1,000 years. The great guns of Orban began their bombardment on April 12th, and their effects soon became apparent. The massive stone balls shattered the outer wall in several places, creating breaches that had to be desperately repaired each night by the defenders. The noise of the bombardment could be heard for miles, a constant reminder to the city's inhabitants that their doom was approaching. Yet the defenders showed remarkable courage and determination in the face of seemingly impossible odds. Constantine the 11th fought alongside his men on the walls, refusing to abandon his post even when the situation became hopeless. The emperor had rejected Ottoman offers to spare his life in exchange for surrender, declaring that he would die as emperor of the Romans rather than live as a Turkish vassal. His resolve inspired the garrison to continue fighting, long after any rational calculation would have counselled submission. The civilian population of Constantinople faced the siege with a mixture of fear, resignation, and defiant faith. Religious processions wound through the streets, carrying icons and relics that were believed to have protected the city in previous crises. The clergy conducted special services in Hagia Sophia, praying for divine intervention that would save the Christian empire as it had been saved so many times before. Yet many inhabitants had already fled the city, recognizing that this siege was different from those that had preceded it. As the weeks passed, the military situation became increasingly desperate. The Ottomans launched several major assaults on the land wall, each one coming closer to success. The Hungarian engineer Orban was killed when one of his own cannons exploded, but his guns continued their destructive work under other commanders. More ominously, the Ottoman fleet in the Golden Horn prevented any possibility of relief by sea, while Ottoman control of the surrounding countryside made escape increasingly difficult. The psychological pressure on the defenders was as intense as the physical bombardment. Ottoman heralds regularly called on the city to surrender, promising that those who submitted would be spared, while those who continued to resist would face slavery or death. Refugees from Ottoman-controlled territories brought stories of cities that had fallen to Turkish assault, their populations enslaved, and their treasures carried off to adorn the palaces of sultans. These accounts spread fear throughout Constantinople and weakened the resolve of some defenders. Yet, there were also signs that gave hope to the beleaguered garrison. Several Ottoman assaults had been repulsed with heavy losses, demonstrating that the walls, though damaged, could still be defended by determined men. Rumors circulated that Genoese or Hungarian relief forces were approaching the city, though these proved to be false. Most importantly, the defenders knew that they were fighting not merely for their own lives, but for the survival of a civilization that stretched back over 1,000 years. The cultural dimension of the siege was apparent to everyone involved. Mehmed II himself was a student of classical history, who understood the symbolic importance of conquering the last remnant of the Roman Empire. He had read accounts of the great sieges of antiquity and was determined that his own conquest should surpass them all in glory and significance. For the defenders, the siege represented the final battle between Christianity and Islam, the last stand of the Orthodox faith against what they saw as the forces of spiritual darkness. The end came on May 29th, 1453, after 53 days of siege. The final Ottoman assault began before dawn, with wave after wave of attackers throwing themselves against the damaged walls. The Genoese commander Giustiniani was wounded and carried from the walls, causing panic among his men who believed their position was lost. In the confusion, Ottoman soldiers managed to scale the walls and open one of the gates from the inside. Constantine XI, realizing that the city was lost, made his final decision as Emperor of the Romans. Throwing off his imperial regalia so that his body could not be identified by the enemy, he drew his sword and charged into the melee around the gate. His body was found later among the heap of dead defenders, identified only by the purple boots that marked his imperial rank. With his death, the Byzantine Empire came to an end after more than 1,000 years of existence. The fall of Constantinople sent shockwaves throughout Europe and the Islamic world. Christian writers described it as a catastrophe comparable to the fall of Jerusalem to the Babylonians, while Muslim authors hailed it as the greatest victory since the conquest of Mecca. The immediate practical consequences were significant. The Ottoman Empire now controlled the strategic passage between Europe and Asia, while thousands of Byzantine refugees fled westward, carrying their manuscripts and their knowledge to Italy and other Western lands. Mehmed II, now known as Mehmed the Conqueror, entered Constantinople in triumph 3 days after the final assault. His first act was to visit Hagia Sophia, the great church that had been the symbol of Byzantine Christianity for nearly 1,000 years. Standing beneath the dome where Byzantine emperors had been crowned, Mehmed ordered that the building be converted into a mosque, symbolically marking the transformation of the Christian city into the Muslim capital of an Islamic empire. The new Ottoman capital that rose from the ruins of Byzantine Constantinople would eventually become one of the greatest cities in the world. Yet something irreplaceable had been lost in the conquest. The last direct link to the Roman Empire had been severed. The final repository of classical Greek learning had been scattered, and a unique synthesis of Christian faith and imperial tradition had come to an end. The Greek scholars who fled westward after 1453 played a crucial role in the Renaissance, bringing with them manuscript copies of classical texts that had been preserved in Byzantine libraries. Their knowledge of ancient Greek made possible new translations of Plato, Aristotle, and other philosophers, while their understanding of classical history and literature enriched Western scholarship. In this way, The intellectual heritage of Byzantine Constantinople lived on even after the empire itself had perished. The Ottoman sultans who ruled from the former Constantinople adopted many of the ceremonial and administrative practices of their Byzantine predecessors. The concept of the ruler as God's representative on earth, the elaborate court rituals, the claim to universal authority over all believers. All these elements of Byzantine imperial ideology found new expression under Islamic rule. The physical city itself retained much of its character, with new mosques and palaces built alongside surviving Byzantine churches and monuments. Yet, the transformation was profound and irreversible. The Greek language, which had been heard in the streets of Constantinople for over 2,000 years, gave way to Turkish and Arabic. The Orthodox Christianity that had defined the city's identity was replaced by Islam as the official religion. The scholar emperors who had patronized learning and the arts were succeeded by sultans whose cultural interests lay in different directions. The city remained great, but it was no longer the same city that Constantine had founded, or that Justinian had adorned with the greatest church in Christendom. For the Orthodox communities that survived under Ottoman rule, Constantinople remained a spiritual center, even though it was no longer a political one. The ecumenical patriarch, though subject to the Sultan's authority, continued to serve as the leader of Orthodox Christians throughout the Ottoman Empire and beyond. The patriarchal Cathedral of St. George, modest though it was compared to the lost Hagia Sophia, became a pilgrimage destination for Orthodox believers who sought to maintain their connection with the city that had been the center of their faith for so many centuries. The memory of Byzantine Constantinople lived on in the Orthodox world through liturgy, literature, and popular culture. Russian Tsars claimed to be the heirs of the Byzantine emperors, calling Moscow the Third Rome, and adopting the double-headed eagle as their imperial symbol. Serbian and Bulgarian churches preserved Byzantine liturgical traditions and artistic styles. Greek communities throughout the Mediterranean maintained their connection to the lost capital through prayers and commemorations that kept alive the hope of eventual restoration. Western Europe, meanwhile, began to romanticize the fallen empire and its capital. Renaissance humanists praised the Byzantines as the preservers of classical learning, while later historians recognized their crucial role in protecting Eastern Europe from Islamic conquest for centuries. The heroism of Constantine the XI and the tragedy of the empire's fall became subjects for poets and dramatists who saw in them universal themes of courage, sacrifice, and the inevitable passage of time. The archaeological rediscovery of Byzantine Constantinople began in the 19th century and continues to this day. Excavations have revealed the foundations of the Great Palace, portions of the Hippodrome, and fragments of the land wall that protected the city for so long. These discoveries have deepened our understanding of daily life in the medieval city and confirmed many of the accounts left by contemporary witnesses. Yet much remains buried beneath the modern city, and much was destroyed by the urban development of recent centuries. The story of Constantinople thus extends far beyond the political narrative of the Byzantine Empire's rise and fall. It encompasses the preservation and transmission of classical learning, the development of Christian theology and liturgy, the creation of artistic and architectural masterpieces, and the complex interaction between different cultures and religions across more than a millennium. The city served as a bridge between ancient and medieval worlds, between East and West, between Christianity and Islam. Perhaps most remarkably, Constantinople demonstrated the possibility of creating a civilization that combined imperial power with intellectual sophistication religious devotion with cultural tolerance, military effectiveness with diplomatic subtlety. The Byzantine Empire was never perfect. It was marked by the same human failings that have characterized all political systems. But at its best, it achieved a synthesis of values and achievements that few societies have equaled. The final saga of Constantinople reminds us that all human institutions, no matter how magnificent or enduring they may seem, are ultimately subject to the forces of historical change. The walls that had protected the city for 8 centuries could not indefinitely withstand the advance of military technology. The diplomatic skills that had enabled the empire to survive numerous crises could not overcome the arithmetic of military disadvantage. The faith that had sustained the Byzantines through so many trials could not guarantee their earthly survival when faced with enemies whose own faith was equally strong. Yet the fall of Constantinople also demonstrates that defeat in the material world does not necessarily mean spiritual or cultural extinction. The ideas, values, and traditions that had been nurtured within the walls of the city spread throughout Europe and beyond, influencing the development of Renaissance humanism, Orthodox Christianity, and our modern understanding of the classical heritage. The physical city passed into other hands, but its intellectual and spiritual legacy became part of the permanent heritage of human civilization. In the quiet hours when we contemplate the rise and fall of great civilizations, the story of Constantinople offers both warning and inspiration. It warns us that power and prosperity are transient, that even the mightiest empires must eventually yield to the passage of time. But it also inspires us with examples of human courage, creativity, and resilience in the face of seemingly impossible challenges. The Emperor Constantine, who dreamed of a new Rome, the architects who built Hagia Sophia, the scholars who preserved classical learning, the soldiers who died defending the walls in 1453, all played their part in a story that transcends the boundaries of any single nation or faith. The waters of the Bosphorus continue to flow between Europe and Asia, carrying the memories of emperors and sultans, of merchants and pilgrims, of all those who have looked upon this narrow strait and seen in it the meeting place of worlds. The city that stands there today is not the Constantinople of the Byzantine emperors, but neither is it entirely different. The same hills rise above the same harbours. The same winds carry the calls to prayer that once carried the chanting of Christian liturgies, and the same human dreams of greatness and transcendence continue to find expression in stone and word and deed. The waters of the Bosphorus continue to flow as they had for millennia, indifferent to the human dramas that had played out upon their shores. In the immediate aftermath of the conquest, as the smoke cleared from the burning buildings and the cries of battle faded into memory, Constantinople began its transformation into something new yet familiar. The Ottoman soldiers who had breached the walls were both conquerors and inheritors, taking possession not merely of a city, but of a legacy that stretched back through the mists of time to the very foundations of empire itself. Mehmed II, now master of the city he had dreamed of conquering since his youth, moved through the streets with a mixture of triumph and reverence. The young sultan understood that he had achieved something his predecessors had only imagined, but he also recognized the weight of responsibility that came with ruling the crossroads of the world. His first acts as sovereign of Constantinople revealed both the pragmatism of a successful conqueror and the vision of a ruler who intended to build something lasting upon the ruins of what had come before. The conversion of Hagia Sophia into a mosque was more than a symbolic gesture. It represented the Ottoman approach to their new capital. Rather than destroying the great church, Mehmed ordered that it be preserved and adapted to serve the new faith. The Christian mosaics were covered with plaster rather than destroyed. The altar was replaced with a mihrab pointing toward Mecca, and 4 minarets were added to the exterior to proclaim the building's new purpose. This pattern of preservation and adaptation would characterize Ottoman rule throughout the former Byzantine territories. The Greek population that remained in Constantinople after the conquest found themselves in a paradoxical situation. Though their empire had fallen and their emperor was dead, they were not entirely without protections under the new regime. Islamic law, as interpreted by Ottoman jurists, granted certain rights to the people of the book, Christians and Jews who, while not Muslims, were recognized as followers of authentic divine revelation. The Greeks who chose to remain in the city were organized into the millet system, a form of communal autonomy that allowed them to maintain their religious practices and internal governance under the overall authority of the Sultan. The appointment of Gennadios Scholarios as the first ecumenical patriarch under Ottoman rule demonstrated both the continuity and the transformation of Byzantine institutions. Gennadios, who had been a prominent opponent of the union with Rome during the final years of the empire, now found himself serving as the leader of Orthodox Christians throughout the Ottoman domains. The ceremony of his installation, conducted in the presence of the Sultan himself, established the precedent that would govern relations between the Ottoman state and its Christian subjects for centuries to come. This arrangement, pragmatic though it was, could not disguise the fundamental reality that the Christian community of Constantinople had become a protected minority within an Islamic empire. The great families that had dominated Byzantine society for generations found their political influence drastically reduced, though many retained their wealth through careful adaptation to the new circumstances. Some converted to Islam and entered Ottoman service, rising to high positions in the administration and military. Others maintained their Christian faith while engaging in trade and commerce under the new regime. The physical transformation of the city proceeded gradually but inexorably. New mosques rose on the hills of Constantinople, their graceful minarets creating a new skyline that proclaimed the Islamic character of the Ottoman capital. The Topkapi Palace, built on the site of the ancient Acropolis, became the new seat of imperial power, its courts and gardens reflecting the sophisticated architectural traditions that the Ottomans had inherited from their Persian and Arab predecessors. Yet the builders of the new capital were careful to incorporate elements from the Byzantine past, creating a unique synthesis that was neither purely Islamic nor purely Christian, but something entirely new. The intellectual life of the city underwent a similar transformation. The scholars who had preserved classical learning in the monasteries and schools of Byzantine Constantinople were replaced by Islamic jurists, theologians, and philosophers who brought their own traditions of scholarship and debate. Yet here too, there was continuity as well as change. Many of the classical texts that had been preserved in Byzantine libraries found new readers among Ottoman scholars, while the mathematical and scientific works that had been translated into Arabic during the early Islamic period were now available to students in the madrasas of Constantinople. The economic revival of the city under Ottoman rule was swift and dramatic. The conquest had initially disrupted trade as merchants fled and commercial networks collapsed. But the establishment of Ottoman authority soon created new opportunities for prosperity. The empire's control over the Black Sea trade routes, combined with its growing dominance in the Eastern Mediterranean, made Constantinople once again the central marketplace for goods flowing between Europe and Asia. Italian merchants who had fled during the siege began to return, establishing new trading houses and negotiating commercial agreements with the Ottoman authorities. The diversity of the Ottoman capital was perhaps its most striking characteristic. Turks from Anatolia, Arabs from Syria and Egypt, Slavs from the Balkans, Armenians from the eastern provinces, Jews from Spain and other parts of Europe, and Greeks who had remained from the Byzantine period all contributed to the cosmopolitan character of the city. Each community maintained its own neighborhoods, religious institutions and cultural traditions, while participating in the broader economic and political life of the empire. The Jewish community of Constantinople grew dramatically during the late 15th and early 16th centuries as refugees from Christian Europe found welcome in Ottoman lands. The expulsion of Jews from Spain in 1492 brought thousands of skilled craftsmen, merchants and scholars to the Ottoman capital, where they established synagogues, schools, and printing presses that enriched the intellectual life of the city. The Ottoman authorities recognized the economic value of these new subjects and actively encouraged Jewish immigration as a means of strengthening the empire's commercial and technological capabilities. The reign of Suleiman the Magnificent, from 1520 to 1566, marked the height of Ottoman power and the greatest period of Constantinople's development under Turkish rule. The Sultan, known to his own subjects as Suleiman the Lawgiver, undertook massive building projects that transformed the appearance of the city. The mosque complex of Suleymaniye, designed by the architect Mimar Sinan, rivaled Hagia Sophia in its grandeur and sophistication, while new bridges, aqueducts, and public buildings demonstrated the wealth and power of the Ottoman Empire at its zenith. Under Suleiman's rule, Constantinople became not merely the capital of a powerful empire, but the center of Islamic civilization itself. The Sultan claimed the title of Caliph, asserting his authority over all Muslims, while his court attracted scholars, artists, and diplomats from across the Islamic world and beyond. European ambassadors who visited the city during this period left detailed accounts of its magnificence, describing palaces that rivaled Versailles, libraries that contained hundreds of thousands of volumes, and ceremonies that demonstrated the sophisticated culture of the Ottoman elite. The architectural achievements of this period reflected the successful synthesis of different cultural traditions that characterized Ottoman Constantinople. Mimar Sinan, the greatest architect of the age, drew inspiration from Byzantine models, Islamic traditions, and classical antiquity to create buildings that were both functionally effective and aesthetically magnificent. His masterpieces, including not only the Suleymaniye Mosque, but also the smaller but more perfect Rustam Pasha Mosque and the Selimiye Mosque in Adrianople, demonstrated how the architectural legacy of Constantinople could be adapted to serve new purposes while maintaining its essential character. The daily life of Ottoman Constantinople reflected this same synthesis of traditions. In the markets of the city, Turkish was heard alongside Greek, Arabic, Armenian, and Italian, as merchants from across the known world conducted their business. The cuisine of the imperial capital combined elements from all the regions of the empire, creating a distinctive Ottoman culinary tradition that remains influential to this day. The music performed in the palaces and coffee houses blended Turkish folk melodies with Persian classical traditions and Arab rhythmic patterns, while the poetry recited in literary gatherings drew on the rich heritage of Islamic verse while incorporating local themes and imagery. Yet beneath this cultural flowering lay the inexorable logic of imperial overextension that would eventually bring about the decline of Ottoman power. The empire's vast territories, stretching from Hungary to Yemen and from Algeria to Persia, required enormous resources to govern and defend. The military campaigns that had brought these territories under Ottoman control continued to drain the treasury, while the administrative challenges of governing such diverse populations grew ever more complex. Most significantly, the technological and economic changes that were transforming Europe during the 16th and 17th centuries began to shift the balance of power away from the traditional land-based empires of the East towards the maritime powers of the West. The first signs of Ottoman decline became apparent during the late 17th century, as military defeats in Europe and economic stagnation at home weakened the empire's position. The failed siege of Vienna in 1683 marked the beginning of a long series of territorial losses that would continue for the next 2 centuries. Constantinople itself remained secure behind its ancient walls, but the empire that it governed grew steadily smaller and weaker as European powers pressed their advantages in technology, organization, and economic development. The 18th century brought new challenges as European ideas about government, society, and individual rights began to penetrate even the conservative atmosphere of the Ottoman capital. The French Revolution and its aftermath sent shockwaves throughout Europe and the Islamic world, challenging traditional assumptions about political authority and social organization. Ottoman intellectuals, many of them educated in European universities, began to question whether their empire could survive without fundamental reforms that would modernize its institutions and adapt them to the changing conditions of the modern world. The reform movements of the 19th century represented a sustained attempt to revitalize the Ottoman Empire through the adoption of European administrative, military, and educational practices. The Tanzimat reforms, beginning in 1839, promised equality before the law for all Ottoman subjects, regardless of religion, the establishment of modern schools and universities, and the creation of a professional civil service based on merit rather than birth or patronage. Constantinople became the laboratory for these experiments in modernization, as new institutions were established and traditional practices were modified or abandoned. The physical transformation of the city during this period was as dramatic as its institutional modernization. Gaslighting replaced oil lamps in the streets, modern sewage systems were installed in the newer districts, and the first railway lines connected Constantinople to the European network of transportation and communication. The Golden Horn, which had served as the city's main harbour for over 2,000 years, was dredged and modernized to accommodate steam-powered ships, while new bridges and roads improved transportation within the city itself. Yet these reforms, necessary though they were, could not address the fundamental problem of ethnic nationalism that was tearing the Ottoman Empire apart. The Greek War of Independence, which began in 1821, demonstrated that the empire's Christian subjects could no longer be counted on to remain loyal to a Muslim state, regardless of how many rights and privileges they were granted. The successful establishment of an independent Greek kingdom encouraged similar movements among the Bulgarians, Serbs, Romanians, and other Christian peoples of the empire, each of whom sought to create their own nation-state based on ethnic and religious identity. The Crimean War of 1854 to 1856 marked a turning point in the international position of the Ottoman Empire. For the first time since the conquest of Constantinople, European powers actively intervened to preserve Ottoman territory against Russian expansion. The British and French, motivated by their own strategic interests in preventing Russian control of the Straits, fought alongside Ottoman forces to maintain the empire's territorial integrity. Yet this support came at a price. The empire was forced to accept European oversight of its internal affairs and to grant extensive economic concessions to foreign powers. The Congress of Berlin in 1878 formalized the Ottoman Empire's subordinate position in the European balance of power. Much of the empire's remaining European territory was either granted independence or placed under the protection of the great powers, while the Sultan's authority over his remaining subjects was limited by international guarantees of minority rights. Constantinople remained the capital of a reduced but still significant empire, but it was no longer the seat of an independent great power capable of determining its own destiny. The Young Turk Revolution of 1908 represented a final attempt to revitalize the empire through constitutional government and national unity. The restoration of the constitution that had been suspended by Sultan Abdul Hamid II in 1878 was greeted with celebration throughout the empire, as representatives of all ethnic and religious communities participated in the new parliamentary system. Constantinople experienced a brief renaissance as newspapers flourished, political parties organized, and intellectuals debated the future of their country with unprecedented freedom. Yet the Young Turk period also revealed the impossibility of maintaining a multi-ethnic empire in an age of nationalism. The Balkan Wars of 1912 to 1913 resulted in the loss of most of the empire's remaining European territories, while the Italian conquest of Libya demonstrated Ottoman weakness even in regions that were considered secure. Most tragically, the empire's entry into World War I on the side of Germany resulted in military defeat, economic collapse, and the beginning of the end for Ottoman rule in Constantinople. The war years brought unprecedented suffering to the civilian population of the capital. Food shortages became severe as the British naval blockade prevented imports, while the empire's agricultural regions were devastated by fighting. The Armenian deportations of 1915, carried out by the Young Turk government in the name of military security, demonstrated how far the empire had departed from its traditional practice of tolerance for religious minorities. The city that had once been celebrated for its cosmopolitan character became increasingly dominated by Turkish nationalism and hostility toward non-Muslim populations. The Allied occupation of Constantinople following the Ottoman defeat in 1918 marked the end of Turkish sovereignty over the city that had been the seat of Islamic empire for nearly 5 centuries. British, French, and Italian forces took control of the strategic points, while the Sultan remained as a figurehead ruler under Allied supervision. The Greek landing at Smyrna in 1919, encouraged by the Allies as part of their plan to partition the Ottoman Empire, seemed to herald the final dismemberment of Turkish power in Anatolia itself. Yet, from this apparent disaster emerged the phoenix of modern Turkey under the leadership of Mustafa Kemal, later known as Ataturk. The Turkish War of Independence, fought from 1919 to 1922, not only expelled foreign forces from Anatolia, but also established the foundation for a new Turkish state based on national rather than imperial principles. The provisional government established in Ankara rejected both the Sultan's authority and the peace terms imposed by the Allies, declaring its intention to create a modern, secular, and democratic republic. The final drama of Ottoman rule in Constantinople unfolded during the autumn of 1922, as Mustafa Kemal's forces approached the city following their victory over the Greek armies in Anatolia. The last Sultan, Mehmed VI, who had collaborated with the Allied occupation, fled the city aboard a British warship on November 17, 1922, ending more than 6 centuries of Ottoman rule. The Caliphate was formally abolished 2 years later, severing the last link between the new Turkish Republic and the Islamic Empire that had once ruled from the shores of the Bosphorus. The transformation of Constantinople into Istanbul, the largest city of the modern Turkish Republic, represented both continuity and radical change. The physical city remained largely unchanged, its monuments and neighborhoods bearing witness to the many civilizations that had flourished there. Yet the new Turkish state that emerged from the ruins of the Ottoman Empire was fundamentally different from anything that had existed there before. Secular rather than religious, Turkish rather than multi-ethnic, republican rather than monarchical, it represented a complete break with the imperial traditions that had defined the city for over 15 centuries. The reforms implemented by Ataturk and his successors were designed to create a modern European-style nation-state from the remnants of the Ottoman Empire. The adoption of the Latin alphabet, the emancipation of women, the separation of religion and government, and the encouragement of Western dress and customs all contributed to the creation of a new Turkish identity that owed more to European models than to Islamic traditions. Istanbul became the showcase for this transformation. Its universities, newspapers, and cultural institutions promoting the values of the new republic. Yet the process of modernization was neither smooth nor complete. The city's population, swollen by refugees from the former Ottoman territories and migrants from rural Anatolia, struggled to adapt to the rapid changes imposed by the government. The Greek and Armenian communities that had contributed so much to the city's commercial and cultural life were reduced to tiny minorities through emigration and population exchanges, while the remaining Islamic institutions adapted with varying degrees of success to their reduced role in public life. The Second World War brought new challenges and opportunities to Istanbul. Turkey's successful neutrality for most of the war allowed the city to serve as a refuge for intellectuals and refugees fleeing the conflicts in Europe, while its strategic position made it a center for intelligence activities by all the major powers. The war's end found Turkey aligned with the Western powers and eager to join the emerging Atlantic community, marking another fundamental shift in the country's international orientation. The democratic transition that began in Turkey during the late 1940s coincided with rapid economic growth and urbanization that transformed Istanbul beyond recognition. The city's population grew from less than 1 million in 1950 to over 2 million by 1970 and more than 10 million by the end of the century. New districts spread far beyond the historic peninsula where Constantine had founded his capital, creating a vast metropolitan area that stretched along both sides of the Bosphorus and deep into the hinterland of Anatolia and Thrace. This explosive growth brought both opportunities and problems. Istanbul became the economic center of modern Turkey, its banks, factories, and commercial enterprises generating much of the country's wealth. The city's universities emerged as leading centers of learning in the Middle East, while its newspapers, television stations, and publishing houses shaped public opinion throughout the Turkish-speaking world. Yet rapid urbanization also created massive slums, where rural migrants lived in poverty. While the historic character of the city was threatened by uncontrolled development and environmental degradation. The cultural renaissance that accompanied Turkey's economic development during the late 20th century saw a renewed appreciation for Istanbul's imperial heritage. Restoration projects undertaken with international assistance brought new life to Byzantine churches, Ottoman mosques, and imperial palaces that had been neglected for decades. The city's museums expanded their collections and improved their facilities, while archaeological excavations revealed new evidence of the rich history that lay buried beneath the modern streets. The rediscovery of the city's Byzantine past was particularly significant, as it represented a reconciliation with aspects of history that had been marginalized during the early Republican period. The restoration of the Carrier Kami, with its magnificent Byzantine mosaics and frescoes, demonstrated that Turkish scholars and craftsmen could appreciate and preserve the Christian heritage of their city. Similarly, the conversion of Hagia Sophia into a museum in 1935 symbolized the secular republic's commitment to preserving all aspects of the city's history rather than privileging any particular religious tradition. The economic liberalization policies implemented during the 1980s accelerated Istanbul's integration into the global economy. The city became a major center for international banking and finance, while its strategic position between Europe and Asia made it an attractive location for multinational corporations seeking to enter Middle Eastern and Central Asian markets. The tourism industry flourished as millions of visitors came to see the historic sites and experience the unique culture of a city that bridged two continents and multiple civilizations. Yet this integration with the global economy also exposed Istanbul to new vulnerabilities. The financial crises that periodically swept through emerging markets during the 1990s and early 2000s demonstrated the costs as well as the benefits of international economic integration. Political instability, terrorism, and regional conflicts all threatened the city's prosperity and security, while environmental problems caused by rapid industrialization and population growth became increasingly severe. The rise of political Islam in Turkey during the early 21st century brought new tensions between the secular traditions established by Ataturk and the religious heritage that remained important to much of the population. Istanbul, as the country's most cosmopolitan city, became the battleground for competing visions of Turkish identity and the proper role of religion in public life. The restoration of the Hagia Sophia's status as a mosque in 2020, after serving as a museum for 85 years, symbolized these broader cultural and political struggles. Despite these challenges, modern Istanbul remains one of the world's most fascinating and dynamic cities. Its population of over 15 million makes it larger than many countries, while its economy generates a significant portion of Turkey's gross domestic product. The city serves as a bridge not only between Europe and Asia, but also between the secular and religious worlds, between tradition and modernity, between the global and the local. The archaeological heritage of the city continues to yield new discoveries that illuminate its rich past. Excavations in the area of the ancient hippodrome have revealed mosaics and structures from the Byzantine period, while work near the Golden Horn has uncovered evidence of the city's earliest settlements. Each new discovery adds to our understanding of how this unique location has shaped and been shaped by the many civilizations that have called it home. The intellectual and cultural life of contemporary Istanbul reflects its position at the crossroads of civilizations. The city's universities attract students from across the Middle East, Central Asia, and the Balkans, while its writers, artists, and filmmakers draw inspiration from both Eastern and Western traditions. The annual Istanbul Biennial has become one of the most important contemporary art exhibitions in the world, while the city's music scene blends traditional Turkish forms with jazz, rock, and electronic music to create something entirely new. The religious landscape of modern Istanbul demonstrates the continuing importance of faith in the life of the city. The The call to prayer still echoes from hundreds of minarets 5 times each day, while the city's churches and synagogues serve communities that trace their presence there back many centuries. The tomb of Ayub Sultan, companion of the Prophet Muhammad, remains one of the most important pilgrimage sites in the Islamic world, while the Ecumenical Patriarchate continues to serve as the spiritual center of Orthodox Christianity, despite its reduced circumstances. The challenges facing contemporary Istanbul are similar to those confronting other major metropolitan areas around the world. Traffic congestion, air pollution, inadequate infrastructure, and growing inequality between rich and poor. The earthquake risk that has always threatened the city has become more pressing as seismologists warn that a major tremor is statistically overdue. Climate change threatens to alter the weather patterns that have shaped life along the Bosphorus for millennia, while rising sea levels could affect the low-lying areas of the city. Yet Istanbul has survived and prospered through so many challenges over the past 17 centuries that its resilience has become legendary. The city has been conquered by armies, devastated by earthquakes, ravaged by plague, and transformed by political revolution. Yet it has always rebuilt itself and adapted to new circumstances. The secret of this resilience lies perhaps in the city's fundamental character as a meeting place where different peoples, cultures, and ideas encounter each other and create something greater than the sum of their parts. The future of Istanbul will undoubtedly bring new challenges and opportunities as Turkey navigates its complex position between East and West, between democracy and authoritarianism, between development and environmental protection. The city's role as a bridge between civilizations ensures that it will remain important regardless of the specific political or economic arrangements that may prevail. The waters of the Bosphorus will continue to flow. The hills will continue to rise above the Golden Horn, and people from around the world will continue to be drawn to this unique place where continents meet and history lives. The story that began with Constantine's vision of a new Rome has become something far more complex and enduring than even that great emperor could have imagined. Through Byzantine and Ottoman empires, through republican transformation and democratic development, through moments of triumph and periods of crisis, the city has remained a testament to humanity's capacity for creating something beautiful and lasting in an uncertain world. The specific forms of government, religion, and culture that have flourished there have changed repeatedly, but the underlying spirit of the place, its openness to new ideas, its tolerance for diversity, its ambition to be more than merely provincial, has remained constant. As we contemplate this long history from our own moment in time, we are reminded that cities, like civilizations, are not permanent fixtures, but living organisms that grow, adapt, and transform in response to changing circumstances. The Constantinople of Constantine was different from the Constantinople of Justinian, which was different from the Constantinople of Basil II, which was different from the Istanbul of Suleiman, which is different again from the Istanbul of today. Yet through all these transformations, something essential has persisted: the recognition that human beings can create communities that transcend their individual limitations and achieve greatness through cooperation, creativity, and mutual respect. The golden light that still catches the waters of the Bosphorus at sunset reminds us that beauty endures even as empires rise and fall. The call to prayer that echoes from the minarets of the city speaks to the same human longing for transcendence that once filled the great dome of Hagia Sophia with Byzantine chanting. The ships that still pass through the strait between Europe and Asia carry the dreams and ambitions of people who seek to connect distant places and different cultures just as merchants and pilgrims have done for thousands of years. In this continuity of human aspiration and achievement, we find perhaps the deepest meaning of the story of Constantinople. It is not merely the chronicle of a particular city or empire, but the record of humanity's persistent effort to create something worthy of our highest ideals. The emperors and sultans who ruled from this place, the architects who designed its monuments, the scholars who preserved its learning, the common people who lived and worked and loved within its walls, all were participants in this larger human project of building civilization. The story continues today as millions of people make their daily lives in the sprawling metropolis that stretches along both sides of the Bosphorus. They face challenges that would be familiar to their ancestors: how to govern diverse populations fairly, how to maintain prosperity without destroying the environment, how to preserve valuable traditions while adapting to changing circumstances, as well as new challenges that previous generations could not have imagined. Their responses to these challenges will determine what new chapters will be added to the long story of this remarkable place. In the quiet hours when the city sleeps and the ancient stones remember their long vigil by the water, the spirit of all who have called this place home seems to whisper across the centuries. They speak of dreams realized and dreams deferred, of victories celebrated and defeats endured, of the eternal human hope that tomorrow might bring something better than today. Their voices blend with the sound of the wind and the waves to create a music that has been playing here since the first settlers chose this spot as their home, and that will continue long after our own brief moment has passed into memory. The waters of the Bosphorus flow on toward the sea, carrying with them the reflections of palaces and mosques, of fishing boats and cruise ships, of a city that has been many things to many people, but has never ceased to be a beacon of human possibility. In its minarets and domes, its bridges and markets, its universities and neighborhoods, Istanbul continues the ancient tradition of this place as a crossroads where the human family meets to trade not only goods but ideas, not only commodities but dreams. The story of Constantinople lives on in every sunrise that gilds the waters of the Golden Horn, in every prayer that rises from its many houses of worship, in every child who looks out across the strait and wonders what lies beyond the horizon. The Queen of Cities endures, transformed but eternal, a testament to the enduring power of human hope and the endless capacity of this remarkable place to reinvent itself while remaining true to its deepest nature as the meeting point of worlds.